Right. My next question for you, James, is you mentioned that one of the Strathens returned to Oak Island in the 1800s, and then he bought the lots that are part of Nolan's Cross, or where Nolan's Cross is located. It
Yes.
sounds to me like some of these Scots wanted to return to Nova Scotia after they had been ousted in 1632. So almost 200 years later, they are back. They are buying lots on Oak Island, and specifically Nolan's Cross lots. So
Yes.
what does that mean?
Well, I mean, it's got to be tremendously significant. And, each one of these Knights Baronet would get 16,000 acres for their property. One of them got 48,000 because he was the son of the man that was robbed, and he went along with the program. And so they gave him 48,000 acres in Nova Scotia. So in their mind, this was literally their American dream. And it all got taken away when King Charles gave Nova Scotia back to France. So a lot of them lost a lot of money, and they were upset and all that. But they still thought of that as their land. So they were going over there long. You typically think of that area being settled by the British in the mid 1700s, and Oak Island was surveyed in 1762. But they were actually going over to escape problems in Scotland, because there's records of, they call it the 15, or it's the battle from 1715, where people that were sons of Knights Baronet or grandsons escaped to Nova Scotia. They were just escaping somewhere that, who knows, there's no historical record of them in Nova Scotia where they went, but there's a record in Scotland that they got out of town fast and went to Nova Scotia to hide out. And that happened to William Alexander's son, John, did, according to the Alexander family, did fake his own death and go back to New Ross and lived at New Ross until Cromwell came in, or not Cromwell, but his men in 1654. And there's quite a story about it, how the Queen of England was the sister of the French king. She was only able to become Queen of England because of William Alexander, because he traveled to Rome to get a dispensation from the Pope, because she was Catholic and Charles was Protestant. So he got the dispensation, brought it back. They immediately got married. So he was absolutely directly responsible for her becoming Queen of England. So why wouldn't she help his son escape? Mm-hmm. Because at that time period, things were getting really bad. It had to do with that book, The Psalms of King David. Alexander, William, the father, had taken a big hit financially because of Nova Scotia, and he was trying everything he could to make money and renew his wealth. And he owned exclusive rights to print the Psalms of King David as translated by King James. King James gave him that right for, I think, 31 years or something like that. So he partnered up with Charles. Charles I was getting a little bit of pressure from his wife. She was Catholic and he was Anglican. And they wanted to combine the churches a little bit more, make them more ecumenical. But the Presbyterians were way outside the box, and so since they controlled Scotland, they made a rule that all the churches in Scotland would have to use this new prayer book that included the Psalms of King David that only William Alexander had the right to print. And back then, books were very expensive, and each church was required to have 2 books. So the Scots, being frugal, thought, there's no way we're going to all buy these books and change our religion and everything for you 3 guys, because it was Bishop Laud of London, Charles I, and William Alexander. And that's all documented, that those are the 3 people. That led to the War of the 3 Kingdoms. It started in Scotland, spread over to Ireland, spread to England, and then Oliver Cromwell took over. So it's fair to say that William Alexander was personally responsible for the Civil War in the British Isles and for Oliver Cromwell taking over. And it got so bad that some of the ministers that refused to, 2 of them that refused to use the book, they brought them to London and they cut their ears off right in front of a bunch of people and said, this is what's going to happen, or worse, we'll start killing you if you don't use the prayer book. So the lords or lairds in Scotland and the ministers, about 400 of them, signed what was called the covenant. And they they pressured Charles to sign it, saying, yeah, I'm your king, but I'm only your king because you let me be your king, and I'm going to leave you guys alone. But that wasn't good enough. That it had already started the ball rolling of rebellion, and they couldn't stop it at that point. So Charles was beheaded in 1649. William Alexander died in 1640. But John, according to the Alexander family, faked his death. He hung out in France for a while, went to Ireland, then went to Nova Scotia until 1654. He got there in 1641. So that means that estate was sitting empty from the time the Latours left, because Charles Latour passed away, Claude, and Charles, the son, moved up to New Brunswick by the St. John River. New Brunswick at the time was considered part of Nova Scotia. So he moved up there. And so it was sitting empty for a while until John Alexander came back to it. And then the family lived there. And there were 4 more sons born there. One of those sons was named Philip. His son that he named Philip founded Alexandria, Virginia. When Cromwell's men tore down your estate, it took them 2 years to get to Virginia. But you can imagine they're in somewhat barren Nova Scotia with the enemy around. They've got to figure a way to hide out, find a ship that's heading down to Virginia, and eventually get down there. So there's that incredible link to Alexandria, Virginia. So, but the other interesting part about it is that another son died in 37. He was the master of public works for Scotland, Anthony. He was the world's second recorded non-operative Mason. And another son, or William Jr., was the first. William Jr. is considered by Freemasonry as the world's first non-operative Mason. That just means they don't go out in the field and work with stone every day. And so one died in 37, the other one died in 38. But the family says that William Jr. went back to Nova Scotia and died there. And of course, he had a son there. He had Daniel LeBlanc there, and he had the LeBlanc, and he had the foundation there. And there's an ambiguous record in Freemasonry that he was also the first Freemason in Nova Scotia, and he was the world's first Freemason. And but the little kicker to that story is that when William the father died, he was buried in the family burial ground. Both of these sons were said to be interred with him. Like 100 and some years later, workmen are working in there. They accidentally dig up William Alexander's grave, and there's only one body in there. So somewhere in that whole story, the bodies did not get to that grave. So where it's wrong, we don't know. But where it could be wrong is that at least William Alexander Jr. went back with his brother John back to Nova Scotia and lived and died there. And John had a son, John. So when you read the John Alexanders, you're not 100% sure of which John they're talking about that moved on down to Virginia. So they have the Alexander family absolutely has the narrative that some of them escaped back to your foundation, to the estate there. And the Mi'kmaq also stated, that it was built by the Alexander family literally for the King of Nova Scotia, they said. And so that would put some of the Alexanders back in the vicinity of Oak Island from at least 1641 to 1654. But if William Jr. had gone back, he would have gone back in 1638. So that would put Alexanders back in that vicinity from 1638 all the way up to 1654.
James, you found another connection between Oak Island and New Ross. Are you willing to reveal it to my audience?
Well, I actually have talked about it on the Jeff Freeman show, and I think I'm not sure where else, but so the beans are a little bit spilled.
Okay.
But everybody looks at Nolan Cross and they'll say, well, it goes all the way over to the Egyptian pyramids if you follow the stem of the cross, or if you put a star on it, you can point where the money pit is and all that kind of stuff. And I don't know, I get these intuitions or insights out of the complete blue, and it's when I'm not thinking about that subject. And so I was just looking at the lots. I think I was looking at the lot map, and I thought, gee, I wonder where the cross arm of Nolan's Cross goes, because nobody ever talks about that. And I'd been there. Charles took me there, so I had seen it physically and everything. I knew it was all there. So I did a very amateurish little map that showed that it went right up to your foundation. So I thought, well, I'm no GPS expert, but I sent it off to the Oak Island team. And what's funny about emailing with the team is if it's around crux time, which is when the show's coming out and all that, it's like radio silence because they're under an NDA just like I am. But then the rest of the year is looser. You get emails back and forth. So nobody answered. I thought, well, that's not out of the ordinary. I'm not going to worry about it. But about a month or two later, I thought, well, maybe my map just wasn't convincing enough. So I did a much more thorough map, sent it off to him, still didn't hear anything. So I thought, well, to get the attention of the Oak Island team, I need Steve Guptill on my side. I didn't have his email address. I have almost everybody's, but I didn't have his. But I wrote the team. I call it the team, and quite often you are on those emails too. And it depends on the subject matter, whatever. And next thing I know, Steve writes me and says, they want me to help you figure this out. And I said, well, we talked about how to do it, and the idea came up that you folks would find a point, a GPS point that you felt accurately represented the foundation. He would take that GPS point and he would actually go and measure the two cross arm points. And he sent me a map with the exact same thing. It was almost verbatim what Brian Farrow had sent me, and a little bit more professional than my maps, but it said the same thing. So the beauty of that is that the two places have been connected through legend a lot, and items from the 1600s found, and the similar story of perhaps William Alexander being involved in all that. But there was never a scientific connection until now. We absolutely know that the cross arm of Nolan's Cross zooms right up to your place. So that just adds to the significance of the whole story. And I'm not the only person that I want to give credit where it's due here to point to William Alexander. The first person to do that was Reginald Harris, and he wrote the first book on Oak Island, but he only wrote a couple paragraphs that indicated that it might have been. Joan Harris wrote, she didn't mention Alexander by name, but she mentioned the Knights Baronet and the minions of Charles I and all that. Court Lindaw mentioned it. Mark Finnan mentioned it pretty dramatically in his books. Now, I never saw any of those books before I came up with my theory, and I actually was lucky enough to email with both Court and with Mark Finnan, and they verified what they thought. Now, Court has a very wide theory. It's you have to really be an eager reader to take all that in. Mark's was didn't seem willing to say what I'm saying, that it was absolutely William Alexander who built the estate and all that. But he did point out the influence of Alexander. And Steve Sora, who's a writer in the past on the Knights Templar and all that, he had written a magazine article that alluded to Alexander. And I was finding those out after I had already done it, and I was looking for confirmation, and here I'm finding there's 5 other writers that kind of pointed to him. I don't think anybody's taken it to the degree that I have, and I've just been focused on it ever since the first book. when I found out that he started the Knights Baronet. Now it's I started that book in 2016. I just got my latest book out, and I'm going to put a plug in for it right now. This is the latest book, Oak Island and New Ross.
Oh, there it is. I see it says New Ross. Wonderful. Oh, I must get that one.
This painting is from 1634, 2 years after they left Nova Scotia. And this is King Charles. I have it in here. King Charles is handing what they call an augmentation of arms to William Alexander for his role in Nova Scotia. Well, that was the center piece of the painting, but all around the edges, they had these little vignettes. They called them miniatures. And I was told they're about the size of a man's hand. And this person that painted it, Edward Norgate, he was so well known for painting accurate miniatures that he even wrote a book on it. He literally wrote the book on painting accurate miniatures. He also was known for putting symbolism in his work. So there are 3 miniatures down the side. One is 2 men in Greek clothing chasing a wolf. Well, obviously nobody in Nova Scotia was wearing Greek clothing. Because they're not wearing anything except the scarf on the back, like you see a Greek god or whatever. And the wolf has been the symbol of Stirling since time immemorial, and William Alexander was the Earl of Stirling. That's where he's buried, at Stirling. So then the next one down was 2 dogs chasing a stag. Well, the stag has been the symbol of the Strachan family since 1309. They actually have a wax mold and a wax seal from 1309 on a document. And I got to go back to the stag before we end this thing. But the third one down was a bear being attacked by guys with spears with a couple dogs. Well, the bear is a symbol of the Gordon family, and William Gordon was the original premier knight baronet. His line died out in 1908, and then my family's line was in second position, so they took over. But so now you have the symbolism of these Greek people chasing William Alexander, and he wrote in his book all kinds of stories about the Greeks. He just absolutely loved the Greeks and the Romans. He was so into that mythology. In fact, he even insinuated that he was the new Typhus, who was the captain of the ship Argo that led the Argonauts, and that he was going to find the Golden Fleece in Nova Scotia. He actually wrote that symbolically in his book. So since he was writing symbolically, we also know Charles I used code where the first letter of each paragraph, we know that for a fact. And they liked to do it back then. They thought they were getting away with something or whatever. Of course, there's supposed to be all kinds of codes in Shakespeare's play. So a colleague of mine and myself, we were discussing this and thinking, wow, what if these are just 3 symbols? That you have the founder of Nova Scotia, you have the financier of Nova Scotia, and you have the military man. And that military man, Gordon, he had 16,000 acres just down below Oak Island, above Port Mutton. And I figured it was about 50 miles to Mahone Bay from his 16,000 acres, and a little less than 60 by the time he got up to Oak Island. And he owned that right during all of this time period. So, so we got this idea that this was symbolism, that this wasn't just and then there was a picture of a wonderful castle-like building up on a hill. Well, the only known building that the Scots built was a fort, which was a 4-sided fort with bastions on the side to shoot from. This was not a fort. It was a castle-like object or building. The only other one that it could possibly be would be up at your New Ross location, because they didn't build anything else. They weren't anywhere else but Port Royal and there. And Claudette Leblanc, who is a famous opera singer in Nova Scotia, she had found in their family a pencil drawing she had the paper dated, and it dated to the 17th century. And it was of a castle that, if you look at them close enough, you can say that they're both the same place. They both have a main tower. Behind them, they have a secondary tower. In front of them, they have you might call it a shed. It's a roof with a typical peaked roof. It has the chimney in the same location. And on her drawing, on Joan Hope's drawing of what she was finding on the ground, she had an area that she called the castle. Then she had an area that she said were mills, like water mills. And then she had the Gold River. The painting shows a mill wheel down below the castle, just like her description. So these three things have to exist for some reason, and they're so similar to each other. And again, there's no other story. Nobody can explain it any other way.
We had psychics tour our property in Ross, and they told us that it used to be somebody's refuge.
Yes, well, that word is used in the writing about the estate. It's called by the family or by the Mi'kmaq. It's called a secret estate, a hideaway in the woods, a refuge. Every word, just about every synonym you can get for the word refuge. So that's cool. And what else did they tell you? Because I got to know. Or can you tell me?
I am under an NDA, and I can't reveal anything until I'd say June. I hope that I'll be able to talk more in June. So you have to, sit tight and wait till June.
Okay. So there's so much that points to the story being true, and there isn't an alternative story. And there may be some alternative stories, but there's no evidence of these alternative stories, whereas there's a lot of evidence for this story. And so I just follow the easy path. If three things are telling me this happened, then I'm going to assume it happened. But I marry that with other research that I've done. Well, would that fit? Just like the Inigo Jones thing. I wasn't just going to accept that she said that he designed it, and the fact that he did absolutely design William Alexander's property in London. I had to know what he was doing in 1623, and I found out that he had some dwell time in there that he could have possibly went over with William Alexander. I mean, William Alexander was, at that point, was incredibly rich. He later in life, he died penniless, but at that point, he was like the right-hand man to the king, and he was friends with Francis Bacon and everything. So he was just given this big plot of land it's probably about 3/4 the size of Scotland. He's just given the entire whole thing. Why wouldn't he take the main architect for the king, which was Inigo Jones, with him, go over in 1623, pick out a spot, survey Nolan's Cross so that people would know when you got to that island, you follow that cross arm of that cross right up the hill, about 17 or so miles, right up to the foundation. And I mean, he had the wherewithal to do it. There was nothing stopping him. And he had the king's blessing. That was the thing about it. So the main, they were in Port Royal. His son was in Port Royal from 29 through 32 when he got booted out. So we absolutely know the Scots were there for those years. The Alexander family and the Mi'kmaq say that they were there as early as 1623. He had sent a boat in 1622, but it didn't make it. And then he sent one in 1623, which is the one I think he was on. And I've been able, this is the other little bit of symbolism in the painting, is I had already identified 17 ships that he had sent over through that time period. And there's across the top is a kind of a long miniature, and it shows what appeared to be 17 ships. And I've counted them many times. They get kind of ghostly in the background, but I've counted them. And I mean, you can make it be 17 ships. And there's no record of him ever sending a fleet of 17 ships at one time. So what I think that is another symbol of all the ships that he ever sent there were all put into that one little painting. The last little miniature to talk about is, it looks like Oak Island. It looks like you're standing above Smith's Cove with a sand spit going out with oak trees on it. There's a guy chopping trees. There's two other guys hewing the logs. There's a guy with a fire that could be a blacksmith fire or it could be a tar kiln. I'm not sure, excuse me. But you know that these two guys are not hewing gigantic logs just to throw in that fire, because there's all kinds of wood to throw in the fire. They were making something out of those. And the one that's the most interesting is there's a guy walking down the hill, and he's either holding logs above his head or he's holding a treasure chest. And again, I've looked at this a million times. I found this in this book from 1836. It was hanging, at that point, it was hanging in this certain place in London called Audley's End. So I wrote Audley's End and I said, are you folks aware of this? Would it still, all these years later, still be hanging in that room? Their curator wrote me back and he said, well, it's not hanging in that room, but we have it. It's on loan from the person that owns it. And I said, well, I'd just like to see it, because I didn't know it had all these miniatures on it or anything yet. I just knew that it was a painting. So months, all these things take months. Like the medallion took months to figure that out. And, you can read it in my book in 5 minutes, but it might have taken me 5 months to get all the details. And so they said they're willing to send me a low resolution image for my personal research. But I had to promise that I would not publish it anywhere. So then when I started seeing the significance and seeing the miniatures and how they parroted what might have happened in Nova Scotia during those years, and there's no other contemporary painting of what was happening in Nova Scotia in the 1620s except this painting. It's the only one that exists. So then I knew I wanted to use it on my book. So on the book and in the book. So I wrote him back and I said, I promise, if you'll send me a high-res version, I promise I will not ever put that online, the entire picture online, if I can just take sections out of it, and I'll give you all the credit in the world for it. So they said, yeah. So when they finally saw my book, they were just thrilled. They saw a PDF of it, but they're going to get their own personal copies, the collector and the curator. But they were just so thrilled that now they're going to be able to set this book right next to the painting on a little easel, say a whole book was written on this painting. But I mean, can you imagine a painting from 1634 that still existed that showed early scenes of Nova Scotia? And the only place they exist right now is either on that painting in London or in my book. There is no other place,
That's fantastic. I think you have done so much in-depth research. I often wish, when I read your books or when I see you on TV, I often wish that Joan Harris, the person who found the remnants of the foundation at New Ross, that she could hear you speak, because I think that you vindicated her. I really do. When she first came out with her own ideas or theory about New Ross, she was not really accepted. By and large, I'd say some people even ridiculed her. They thought she was, too far out there. But I really think that she would like what you have to say.
Well, and I sent a PDF of it to John Noss too, and I wasn't sure because I didn't ask permission to quote him, but I knew that I think he will feel vindicated too and realize that she was vindicated, because they were very good friends for 38 years, I think. And I thought, he probably, I could even imagine him welling up with tears reading about how he helped her and how, because they didn't know at the time that the Alexander family had the same theory that they did. That was held tightly. And I asked him in an email, I said, how did you hear that New Ross was a foundation for William Alexander? He said, my grandfather chose me out of all his grandkids to carry the family secrets. And over a 3-year period, he told me all of the old Mi'kmaq stories. And he said, now I can't I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but he said, I can't prove that they're all true. You know, he said, whatever the truth is, but this is what he told me, and this is what I passed on to Joan Harris. And so it's slightly coincidental or ironic, I guess you'd say, that she passed away the same year that the Lagunas bought Oak Island. And had they been able to go up, and she was in Ontario at that point, and had they been able to go interview her to find out what she knew. But anyway, it was so much fun. All the books are fun to write. This one, I would say, it's particularly good, and it was particularly fun because of these mammoth discoveries of the Nolan Cross situation, of this painting from 1634, the fact that the premier baronet at the time just lived 50 miles from Mahone Bay, or had a land there anyway. And and then a lot of people joined in out of the blue. A gentleman whose ancestor wrote the charter for Nova Scotia wrote me, and he sent me, he was sending me like an overview in the beginning, but then he sent me some specific paragraphs. And he said this, in one case, he was indicating that he thinks the first boat that came over, that didn't make it, that came in 1622, was called the White Hind, which is like a white female deer with antlers, which doesn't exist, but so it's a mythical creature. So I looked it up, and by gosh, there was a ship called the White Hind that was sailing out of London by 1587. So it would have almost certainly still been around. They didn't just throw those ships away. And then a few other people wrote me. I can't remember them all now, but I'm like, everybody's just helping me on this book, you know. And I have to tell you that, you know, you said that you had psychics up there, and I've had so many intuitions and so many fortunate discoveries. But one of them that was absolutely amazing was I was up there to Nova Scotia, and I just, for something to do, because I had some downtime, which normally they don't give you much downtime. It's a working vacation. You're up there for 3 or 4 days, and you're zooming, not digitally. You're zooming physically from one place to the other. But I went in, just, I don't even know why. I was heading to this other bookstore, and I saw this different bookstore, used books across the street. Went in there, said, "Do you have anything from the 1600s here?" And the clerk laughed, and she said, "No, everything starts here in the 1800s." She said, I'll show you the local books, local history books." So we walked over to this aisle, and as we turned the corner, I saw this book down on the bottom amongst 100 other books. Nothing on the heel of the book to indicate what it was. Nothing, totally a nondescript book, but my eyes went right to it. Turned around to look at the local books, and I just saw a blur. I could not even see these books. And I turned around to that book. I said, "What is that book right there?" Because it was just grabbing at me. She said, "I don't know." Picked it up, fanned it open. Here's a story about William Alexander and the Book of Prayers, and cutting the ears off the ministers and all that. And that was the end of the story for me. That was the one part of the story that I knew he died in 1640, but I didn't know the final years, what had happened. And here, now I had it in my hand, on a total fluke. And when those kinds of things happen, and then I even just be telling you about it, my backbone shivers, because there's no way that was a coincidence. There's no way that was a coincidence. And a lot of my writing, even before I got involved with Oak Island, happened that way. I would literally, like, I was looking for this one book, and I was in a antique shop with my sister, and I said, "Well, I got to get going. I got to drive 4 hours." And she said, "Well, I thought you wanted one of Sir Walter Scott's books." I said, "Yeah, but we haven't been able to find it. I got to get going." She tripped over 6 books laying in front of her. She reached down and she said, "Oh my God, I think this is his book." It was a book of poems by him, and I was looking for a specific poem, and I fanned that book open right to that poem. And see, now I'm getting the old chills in the spine again, and I'm like stunned, because this is what I spent 2 hours in that thing. And when I finally gave up, I'm not going to find anything here bam, it comes to you, you know. And it's so, and there is that theory in that type of spirituality that if you can ask for something and you likely will get it, but if you keep asking for it, you're going to tick somebody off and they're not going to give it to you. But if you ask for it, sometimes if you just write it down, throw the paper away or whatever, the next thing you know, when you least expect it, it pops up right in front of your face.
So since you have strong sense of intuition, can you tell me what your intuition is about this medallion?
Well, Christopher Monk financed William Phipps to get the Concepcion treasure, and he brought back literally what would be millions of dollars to Monk and to King James II at that point. And Monk had falling out with the king because the king there was a conspiracy against him, and several men protected him, and Monk was one of them, but he never recognized Monk as being one of them, and he recognized these other two people with high titles and all that. So Monk got mad, and he gave up all of his titles, which would be all of his medallions and everything, and that he was the one that originally owned that medallion, because the only 3 men received that medallion that year in 1671. One of the medallions is in the British Museum. The other one was in a museum in Sweden, and I contacted both those museums. The one in Sweden was stolen with a bunch of other stuff and melted down, but luckily they had tons of photos of it. So in that particular book, I have all of them side by side, and they're all identical. So the only thing that isn't identical is what mechanism held them to a chain that they could wear. So what I think happened was William Phipps was given an honorary knighthood by King James. Well, he wasn't even qualified to have any kind of knighthood because he was born in America, not in England. So it had to be an honorary knighthood. And since Monk was his benefactor, and Monk didn't want that medallion anymore because he gave up all his offices and knighthoods and everything because he was filthy rich at this point. He didn't care about any of that. I think that they gave that medallion to William Phipps as his recognition that he was a knight. When he came back, he was celebrated as the Knight of New England, or New England Knight, they call him, and everything. Well, he came up to Nova Scotia. He was there was some back and forth, and they blamed it on the Mi'kmaq, but I think it was actually French people in disguise coming down dressed as Indians to attack English forts, and it was causing a lot of trouble. So they asked for somebody to lead a group to go up there, and I think it was 700 men. So the first place he went was Port Royal, but just like Robert Sedgwick, he went all over the place. And in fact, there are records that he also made it to La Havre. And so I think that he was wearing that medallion while he was at your foundation, and they got into the reason I think they got into some kind of a battle is because at the very bottom of the medallion, it's dented a little bit on the front, which is St. George slaying the dragon. But on the backside where the type is, raised type, it's really dented. So something struck that medallion. Now, it could have been a million other things, but since he lost it there, and he probably relished it, he would have, you'd think if something that heavy fell off your neck, you would realize it and start looking on the ground for it. So at least one scenario is that they got in a battle either with the French or the Mi'kmaq up there, and he was struck with a club that knocked it off. He was fighting for his life. They left, and it laid in the dirt there, got buried a couple inches down, and then your friend with his Tonka toy found it when he was a kid, and it laid there from, he went up in 1690. So in theory, that medallion laid there from 1690 until 1970, whatever, roughly in there when it was found. It was before the earlier treasure trove laws.
James, did Joan Harris know about that medallion? Was she aware of it?
Well, I can't say that. I can't say that she did. The only reason I was so quick to say no is that the gentleman that found it did not want anybody to know he found it. He only told a few people, basically his family, because he was afraid the government would take the medallion away. And Rick and Doug had to get a letter from the Nova Scotia government swearing that they would not take that medallion from him if he showed it to us. So we were up at your place. We stopped back and met up with a cousin again. And we said, can you get him to bring it to the war room? And he said, well, I don't know. He said, he's so protective of it and worried about it. And he said, maybe next week. And I said, well, it can't be next week because I'm flying out on Sunday. And this was Friday. And I said, if it's tomorrow or never. And for me, at least for me. And he said, well, I'll see what I can do. So I thought I was going to have another free day Saturday before the flight. And Doug calls at 8 o'clock in the morning, says, get ready. He's coming to the war room at 10 o'clock with a medallion. So I get over there about 9:30, and there's Rick on the phone with Prometheus trying to tell him to get the cameras down there, and they're telling him they can't. He says, here, Jim, you talk to him. So he hands me the phone, and I can't remember who it was. And if I did, I probably wouldn't say the name right now anyway. But I'd only talked to him one other time, and that was about my car rental, which was, totally different scope. But I said, this is a big deal for Nova Scotia to find a 1671 knighthood medallion in relatively good shape. And he said, I know, but he said, my guys work long, long hours every day. And when Saturday comes, they're just gone. They go to the beach or wherever, And he said, it would probably take me 4 hours to find enough people to even call it a crew. And then I can't even guarantee it. And I said, well, I know one thing, the guy isn't going to stick around for 4 hours because he didn't even want to come there. So we went to the war room, and it was just me and Doug and Rick. And he came in with his cousin, who we had met the day before, and with this other gentleman that was a friend of his. And Rick said, okay, Jim, you run the meeting. So I said, well, if you show us the medallion and tell us the story about how you found it, I'll tell you who it first belonged to and how I think it got to New Ross. So, boy, he was just shaking to get it out because, this has been his prized possession since he was a kid, and 30-some years earlier that he found it. And he had it all in a nice little wooden box wrapped in a felt cloth and everything. So he got it out, and he told us about the Tonka toys, and they were making a road or something, and there it was. And where it had been kept, and his aunt kept it for him for a while, and he had it hidden here and hidden there and all that stuff. So then I told him about my theory. I told him who it originally belonged to, which was Christopher Monk, and then how I thought it got the whole knighthood story and how I thought it got to there. And then he put it on a sheet of white paper so that we could photograph it. So the best, I don't have that book in front of me, but you just showed it. But that is the absolute best photograph, I believe, of that medallion, because the only other one that existed, which I believe Doug sent me, was like a Polaroid of it laying on the floor, and it was just really small and blurry. Okay.
James, how did it feel to see an artifact from 1671?
Oh my gosh, it was just incredible, and the story behind it made it worth even more. I've been to tons of museums in Scotland. I've traveled a lot around the world, Egypt and Peru and China, and all backpacked all through Europe and stuff. So I've seen a lot of old artifacts, but they were just old artifacts. They didn't mean anything personally to me. Now, this was part of my story. And I tell you, we were just all three of us. And there's a photo that I have. I don't think I sent it to you, but you may have seen it in the past, where I'm photographing the medallion on the white piece of paper that he laid it on, and Rick and Doug both have their necks just stuck right out, like, when's my turn? And they had a magnifying glass already, and they checked it over. And I think it was one of them that had noticed, probably Doug, noticed the smashed part of the medallion. And he said, what is this going on here? And the guy didn't know. And there wouldn't be a much different explanation, because it couldn't have been somebody, well, it might have been somebody who stepped on it, but it was just laying in relatively loose dirt an inch or so down under the ground. So you wouldn't think just pressure from somebody accidentally stepping in all of your land up there on that one spot and crushing it, or how would you drop a rock on it or whatever? So it just seemed like it had happened just before it was lost. Not sure on that, but that's my theory. And so great. And so we talked right away about, well, let's see if we could take it to the British Museum and weigh the two, measure them for thickness, and possibly even do some kind of metal alloy. Well, the owner of the New Ross medallion did not want to do that. He did not want it out of his sight. He'd been holding on to it for 30 some years. He wasn't about to let it go. That subject has come up again a couple times of going to the British Museum and actually seeing the other one and comparing them. And what we could do is we could take all the weight measurements and if he would allow us, the metal alloy in Nova Scotia, then just take those records with us and go to the British Museum and say, okay, this is our medallion now. How does it match your medallion? But physically, they look identical. And there's no personal name on them. The only way I knew there were only 3 of them given out that year is because there's a long, long list of people who got that knighthood, and they're all listed by year. There were only 3 in that year.
Mm-hmm. So, was there anything found on Oak Island or around Oak Island that goes back to the 1600s that would fit your theory?
Well, yeah, actually, there's been a lot of wood found at depth that's been dated in ranges that would date that my theory would fit in. And in fact, originally I took 3 carbon dating records from Fred Nolan and Dan Blankenship, and I drew a bar graph of how they crossed over each other, and the window they made was 1620 to 1654. And I couldn't believe it. I'm like, that is my story right there, and I didn't make this happen. That was what they were. Well, I know they found a chunk of axe cut wood in the money pit that was dated as old as 1626. They found a piece of wood in situ under the original stone platform that they found that dated to 1619. And they found a little ox shoe that was on. You haven't seen this last week's show, have you?
No, I haven't, but friends told me that Carmen Legg identified an ox shoe. That's very interesting.
I was on that one too. I was on 2 weeks in a row, and I didn't know either time I was going to be on, because they never absolutely ever tell you that you're going to be on. And usually you have to see yourself in the previews, and I wasn't in the previews, so I was shocked both times. But, you know, I think when he identifies things, it may not be so immediate as the camera shows it, you know. I mean, he may study it for a few minutes, and then he says, you know, but he's an expert on oxen. You know, some people say, well, how would he know that's whatever, you know? He's an expert on, he's written a book. He's written the book on taking care of oxen. You can buy it on Amazon. And he's a historical blacksmith. He's not just a blacksmith. You know his past and where he's worked and everything. And so if there's anybody that would be an expert on ox shoes in Nova Scotia, it would be Carmen Legg. I mean, he's just the man, you know. So when they said Scottish, of course, I was already so smiling because I was on the show. But then when he said that was Scottish, that was totally unexpected. And then I think it was Jack, or I can't remember who was there, said, would you have a date? Would you have a date on it? And he said 1610 to 1730.
That's amazing. That's amazing. So we have 17th century Scottish ox shoe on Oak Island.
Yes, yeah. And one thing about the Scots, they took 200 cattle with them. Well, today we think of cattle as cows, which would include oxen, you know, but back then, cattle meant any kind of livestock. It just evolved into meaning cows. So they had 200. Now they didn't break them down by species. Some of them may have been horses. Some of them were undoubtedly sheep, because even the French to Champlain, they were carrying sheep with them. They might have been goats for milk. Who knows, you know? But there were 200. And you think, well, you know, they weigh a lot of, you know, oxen particularly weigh a lot. But though when they took their first big group over, they had 4 ships. One of them was 300 or 350 ton burthen, which means that's their that's their hold capacity, their cargo capacity. That's a lot of tonnage. You're not going to have, how much are 200 cattle going to weigh? And they had 3 other boats to carry them on. So the idea that they could take them there, I mean, the records say they took them there, but and some of those could have been oxen because their goal was to build towns, and oxen are the work animal. There's, even the road, like Ian Spooner said, a lot of work went on in the swamp during the 1600s. I mean, there's other quotes too, but of course my ears hear everything that says 1600 or Scottish, and again, you say Scottish and then you think a bunch of Highlanders or whatever. Well, they were under the auspices of the English. They sailed out of London. The English king, who was Scottish himself, he's born in Scotland. William Alexander was born in Scotland, but they were at this point, adopted English. So in a sense, it was the English, but almost all the early knights baronets that signed up were Scottish chiefs of clans. The MacLean clan, the Gordon clan, the McGuinness clan, not the McGuinness, the Innes clan, which there's a backstory to whether the McGuinness family is from that Innes or from another McGuinness family. But I do have to tell you, I mentioned William Vaughan a while back as being a friend of William Alexander, and that he had a place in Newfoundland. I absolutely traced Anthony Vaughan Jr. to William Vaughan, the friend of William Alexander. Traced John Monroe to the son-in-law of William Alexander. Traced John Strachan to Al Strachan, the thief of the robbery. And he robbed it in October of 1622, and he also robbed the young wife of this, I guess I'd call him a billionaire back then. He was one of the richest men. And the 1622 and 23, and I found this in the Privy Council minutes and in another book, was a terrible financial time for the king, which meant at that point for everyone else. And he was actually hawking some of his jewels to these lairds and saying, if you give me a loan, I'll pay you back in a couple of years when I can or whatever. So King Charles was as anxious as William Alexander was to go find a place where there was essentially free lumber, free gold to dig up, free beavers to trap, and bring it all back and all of a sudden have a bunch of wealth. And Alexander even wrote during that period, he said, we have resorted, paraphrasing a little bit, but he said, we have resorted to stealing from each other or being privateers taking Spanish ships. That's how desperate it had gotten. So if you think of Strachan, of this Robert Gordon, of the son, William Keith, the son of the man that was stolen, another guy that was in on the robbery, and the guy that was the cautioner or guarantee of Strachan appearing in court, were all the first Knights Baronet of Nova Scotia. So the fix had to be in. I mean, the guy that stole this great treasure was sitting in a chair next to the guy who would have inherited it. And instead he got, I guess he got some of it back, and he got some of the castles back. He got the title Earl Marshal, and he got this 48,000 acres of Nova Scotia. So again, it's the easiest story. There's no others. How else do you explain all these people involved in this robbery, all sitting in the same room, becoming the world's first Knights Baronet of Nova Scotia? And so, I don't know.
James, what about the McQuiston family? Were the McQuistons ever knights in Scotland or knight baronets in Nova Scotia?
Yes. So we come from the MacDonald clan, and there's a funny saying. The first time I went up to Nova Scotia was in 2010, and they told me I would never get on Oak Island. But, I talked to a lot of people and was listening to the music, and somebody said, if you swing a cat in Nova Scotia, it'll hit 2 McDonald's and a McLean. And I would see like McDonald Oil and Lube and McDonald's Lobsters, but not the company McDonald's, but actually the last name of the person that owned it. They were everywhere, But so my forefather, his name was Donald MacDonald, and he was the chief of the clan. Our clan came out of the Isle of Skye, and the first chief on the Isle of Skye of the MacDonalds his name was Ushton, or some people say it's pronounced like Ocean. I've had 3 Gaelic speakers tell me that right to my face, and I still can't pronounce what they're saying. It's so bizarre, but it's like Ushton, and there is a theory that it was the sound of the ocean, that he was named after the sound of the ocean. But so he had 6 sons, and at least 4 of them are recorded in their lifetimes as McQuiston, or however you say it, McOcean. And in fact, there was a branch of McDonald's that was called the Ocean McDonald's, a separate branch. So the McDonald's were very powerful. They almost had their own kingdom. At one time, they did have their own kingdom up in the Highlands and out on the islands, particularly the Isle of Skye. So and they were married into the Stuarts, and Charles and James were both Stuarts. So they knew that it was somebody to contend with. They couldn't just ignore their wishes. So when they were recruiting clan chieftains to become Knights Baronet, Donald MacDonald said, "I'll become one, but I want to be the premier Knight Baronet." Well, they'd already promised that to Robert Gordon, who was this military intelligence guy he knew all kinds of secrets. He had done all kinds of work for James and Charles, both, his son Charles. Really extreme work. He chased William Sinclair from Roslyn up to the Orkneys, a lot of stuff. So he really couldn't face Gordon and say, "Well, I'm sorry, I promised this to you, I'm going to take it away from you." So instead, he made Donald MacDonald the second Knight Baronet, or secondary Knight Baronet. And I have 2 records in the words of I guess it would be James, because they were, it started out with King James, but he died like 4 days later, and King Charles had to pick up the ball. But 2 different writings of him saying specifically that he had promised Donald MacDonald to be the premier Knight Baronet. So as it shook out in the end, Gordon was the premier one, and his line held that till 1908. But my family held the secondary position until 1908, and then they moved up to the primary position. So the man who right now is the premier Knight Baronet, his name is Sir Ian MacDonald McQuiston, which they call that last name the patronymic, because that's the branch of the family that he came from. And I had emailed him a number of times before I ever really got onto this Oak Island thing. And I never really outright asked him about what the Knights Baronet were about or anything. He had a number of titles, so I just thought that's just one more title. I was asking him about the family. And so we've had that in the MacDonald McQuiston family since 1625, and we still have it, which is pretty cool. So, and I thought in the future, if it ever came about, maybe I could talk Sir Ian into coming to Nova Scotia, since he's the premier Knight Baronet of Nova Scotia, and meeting in the war room. That would be just so cool. I also talked to the owner of the painting and said, would you guys send the painting over or bring the painting over? Because a lot of people don't know this, and there's maybe reasons why they don't want to emphasize it. But this year is the 400th anniversary of the founding of Nova Scotia. Last year was the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower landing. The very next year, William Alexander was given Nova Scotia. And I've written the governor or the premier, whatever his position is. I've written their office. I'm a member now of the Royal Historical Society up there. And I've written a number of people, but nobody has picked up the ball about the fact that this painting exists that shows it. And somebody told me that it may be because the French were there first, so they would claim they found it, and the Mi'kmaq were there before the French, and so they would say they founded it. So to just arbitrarily pick one of the 3 and say they're the people that founded it, but that is when it was named Nova Scotia in 1621. So this at least is the 400th anniversary of it being named Nova Scotia.
Mm-hmm.
So
was John Harris descended from a Knight Baronet?
Yes. Well, for all intents and purposes, it appears she wrote in her book about Thomas Hope, Sir Thomas Hope, Knight Baronet, and we know her maiden name was Hope. And so I looked him up, and yeah, he was a Knight Baronet, but it took me a few days before I realized he was the actual lawyer for all of the Knights Baronet. And I found that he had sent dozens and dozens of communications back and forth with William Alexander. There was only one that mentioned Nova Scotia, and it was about basically settling or dismissing a debt. And I wonder if it was the dismissal of because all these people had given their money to William Alexander, and now he had nothing. They had nothing to show for it. And he had nothing to give them. So I wondered if they had done some legal thing to get him out of hot water with all the Knights Baronet. So Thomas Hope wasn't just a Knight Baronet. He was the lawyer for the Knights Baronet. There was some relation, his daughter or somebody that had married an Erskine, a man named Erskine, and William Alexander was married to Janet Erskine. So the thing about it is that, when you look back at these people, and particularly the big heroes like William Wallace or Robert the Bruce, and they're standing out from all the other people, but Scotland was a relatively small country. It's a little bit bigger than Nova Scotia, and a lot of people in Nova Scotia know each other, and a lot of people intermarried. And there are basically two kind of marriages in Scotland and most of those countries at the time. One was somebody within walking distance, and often that person was a cousin. The other one was the arranged marriage between two really high up level people, because they wanted to, especially if it was a case where the father died and he only had a daughter, and then everybody and his brother that was single that saw the castle that she lived in wanted to marry her, and so there'd be arranged marriages or there'd be marriages within walking distance. But the point is, there weren't that many people for them not to be related or to have worked together or fought together in a battle or at least known each other. So I kind of started with the idea, well, how did this guy know that guy or whatever? But the real question would be, how did he not know him? Especially in the case of William Alexander, because he was a famous poet. In fact, there's some indications that he might have been part of the whole Shakespeare playwriting. And where he lived, you could walk to Charing Cross, or you could go across the bridge to Shakespeare's theater. That's how close it was. You could walk to either one of them. And he had written some plays where the ideas from his plays were used by Shakespeare. And Shakespeare, I guess, he was notorious for borrowing from other writers. And William Alexander was a friend of Ben Jonson, who was also a good friend of Shakespeare. So there's a theory there too, and he was a friend of Francis Bacon, which of course is the big theory about. And I don't get into that too much because it distracts. Like, I don't want to be the writer that throws everything from the kitchen sink to the pyramids into this theory. I want to say, this is a document I found. This connects to this document, connects to this family tradition. So I have a narrow, it's a tip of the iceberg theory, but there's a bunch of other stuff behind it. If I wanted to make these books twice as thick, I could. But even myself, when I read a super thick book, I'm like, I can only absorb so much, So I try to keep it down to every paragraph is like, bam, there might be 3 sources written in that one paragraph, and it's one paragraph after another of that. And but it comes easy, I gotta say. Part of it is I just love the whole story, and secondly, I've been studying Scottish history for a few decades. I mean, I started when I was a kid, and that's how I got this fellowship with the Society of Antiquaries. So I knew a lot of the backstory about Scotland. And so, and who doesn't love a treasure mystery on an island? I mean, Treasure Island, Count of Monte Cristo, all that. So I have to tell you a real quick story. So Charles took me down to the Nolan's Cross, and on the way back, I saw his Mason's ring, and I said, "Oh, wow, that's a nice ring." And he showed it to me, and he said, and look at this. And he pulls the Knights Templar ring out of his pocket. And I said, well, why don't you wear that? And he told me the reason why, which I don't want to talk about. But he was just smiling from ear to ear. And I said, you look like the happiest man in the world. He said, why wouldn't I be? I search for treasure on an island every day of my life. He cracked me up with that. But everybody up there is so nice. From you guys to Rick to Charles and Doug, and everybody's got their own. Like Charles and Laird are very calm. They're watching and listening to everything, and when they chime in, finally, they wanted to say something. Gary's like a rabbit, and Jack is kind of too. Jack jumped when I was doing he was in a lot of my presentations, and invariably he'd jump ahead in the story. And I said to him once, I bet you in school you used to go to the back of the book and read the end of the book, didn't you? And and Rick is just so absolutely kind that it's absolutely beyond belief that a single person could be that kind. So, yes.
James, you toured Oak Island several times, and you got to, I guess, ride around in the golf cart alone.
Yes.
So you were able to see some parts of Oak Island that probably a lot of other people never get to see. Knowing what you know, based on your theory and all the artifacts that have been found so far, where on Oak Island would you look for the Scottish treasure?
Well, Rick asked me the exact same question. I said I would keep looking in the money pit. Here's my theory. The guys found it in 1690 or 1795, as the story goes, and all those guys were related back to significant people, like John Smith's uncle was a McLean, and the McLeans go all the way back to the Knights Templar. Anthony Vaughan was related to William Vaughan, who was William Alexander's good friend. So there's connections there, and so I think it's at least possible, based on everything I've read, and I obviously read a bunch of it. They found some stuff, and the McGinnis sisters said they did. The Vaughan family had a tradition, and other people that knew the Vaughan family had a tradition that they had bags of coins hidden in their wall, and they would, the kids would take their friends in and say, reach in and get a couple coins, but don't tell anybody about it. And so there's supporting evidence that those three families walked away with something. And then the Truo group came. Well, the Truo group had the original finders were, advisors or part of it. And at that same time, John Strachan owned the Nolan Cross lots, right during the time of the Truo group. Well, John Strachan's uncle William is one of the original investors and directors of the Bank of Nova Scotia, which eventually became Scotiabank. And you don't become a investor or an underwriter if your pockets are empty. So I thought, wow, that's crazy. I'm going to look into the history of Scotiabank, because everything takes you on another trail, and then you spend a week on that, and then you either get a couple gems out of it or you give up. At the turn of the century, of the 1900s, every underwriter of the National Bank of Nova Scotia was a financial institution, except one person whose name was John Strachan. So my theory is that when the Truo group went there, they found additional treasure that was divvied up between all those people. Then when the next group came, which I think was the Oak Island Company or Oak Island Association, I'm not sure, but a lot of those members were members, some of them were members from the Truo group, and they also had two of the original three men were still alive and acted as advisors, even though they were in their 70s. So they still had a crew that was familiar with the situation. And that's when the pit collapsed. And so when they're drilling down there, they're finding human bones. They're pulling up pottery. They pulled up that gold-plated button. They pulled up shoe leather, everything else. So one scenario, at least, could be that the three young men found some They talked people into, because they couldn't manually dig any further than 30 foot on their own. They came in, they found some more. Some of the same people got together again and brought the next group in, and they kind of messed up because they had that idea of tunneling next to it and coming across, then it collapsed it down in. And so whatever was left is spread in a debris field there. And I know I've heard Rick talk about that particular theory, that it's spread in a debris field. But the other quick thing is that Fred Nolan said that he had found, I think it was 11 places on Oak Island where it appeared that something had been buried. It had been dug up and it was heavy enough to be dragged down to the shoreline. So if my theory is correct that they had to do this in a hurry, they may have said, well, get these other chests buried. We're going to make the main hole here, but get these other chests buried around. If we just have to dig up one thing, because we don't want to dig up this big pit, we'll just grab this one chest that we know is by this marker. And the thing about it, that this book and the discovery about the Nolan crossarm is the fact that Charing Cross was actually a stone used to measure by, and people are now trying to measure by Nolan's cross. So there is no reason at all to believe that Nolan's cross wasn't built that way to be measured from. It just stands to reason that, so I know that more things will come. And every time I write a book, right at the end, a lot of things start pouring in, and I'm trying to squeeze them in. And I could take that paragraph out, it's non-essential, and put it there or whatever. But then even after I get it done, and it can be at the printers getting my print proofs, and something else comes in. And so it's an endless story. It's not, and I wish that all of my books were one book for the sake of me and for everybody that's reading it, but it didn't work out that way. I told you the story. It was all incremental and hierarchical the way they happened, which maybe it had to be that way, because if I'd been flooded with all this information in the beginning, I would have probably blown my mind over it all, So I was learning, and then I was teaching, I guess you could say. And I don't imagine it's over, but I can't imagine writing another book. Although I have one in my mind. But I'm a little bit burnt out on writing books, at least about Oak Island. I love the show. I would never miss. I have to tell you, Rick gave me, the first year I was there, gave me one of those black T-shirts with I wear that every Tuesday night to watch the show. It's just like a religion with me. And even if I'm mad because the show last week didn't tell me enough information or whatever, and okay, well, I'm going to watch it no matter what this week, I'll still put this stupid shirt on, sit there in my lazy boy and watch the show.